We don't realize that we can only achieve when we know who we are and we know that we have value. And that's not the case, unfortunately, in many African countries.
The Battle of Adwa.
And then Italy comes to Ethiopia to secure their colony. And at the Battle of Adwa on March 1st, 1896, the Italian army is completely annihilated.
How do we ensure that African Americans and the Africans in the diaspora are able to work together with Africans in the continent? We had seen leaders such as Malcolm X doing back in the days.
And Malcolm saw that potential in the 1960s. And that's why he traveled to Africa in 1964 extensively. Gaddafi realized that he could do a lot with Libya's gold. And one of the plans that had already started was to launch a new African currency.
Welcome to yet another episode of theREN Experience, where we celebrate those who have made a difference in our times and inspire you to do the same. Now, if this podcast inspires you in any way, I kindly ask you to do me a favor by subscribing to the channel. We aspire to grow and bring you the guests that you want to see on the show, and your subscription will help us get there. Karibu sana. How have you been since last time we spoke? I remember you had started working out.
Oh yeah, I'm good. I'm feeling very good, very healthy, It's good to be healthy as the summer comes,
Indeed.
Yes.
Indeed it is. That's good to hear. The Battle of Adwa. That has been your recent book, right? And I think
Yes, that's my new book.
I've been seeing it a lot around, and I like the fact that you are trying to cover what is hidden or at least left out in history, because those are usually the most important moments that we need to help us really understand what we are capable of.
Absolutely. And we don't know our history because we don't even teach our history, which is very disappointing, actually. We don't realize that we can only achieve when we know who we are and we know that we have value. And that's not the case, unfortunately, in many African countries, If you go to India, there's an Indian identity. They're not ashamed of that, right? If you go to China, there's a Chinese identity. They're not ashamed of that. In fact, that is the reason why they're achieving economically now, because they're not trying to ape the West. They're not copying the West. They're building China, knowing that they are people with a long history of achievement. There was some disruption and interruption when China was dominated at some point by the West. But China has recovered its sovereignty. And since the Chinese Revolution has been building China, that is why China is an emerging, preeminent power, while on the other hand, the United States is on the decline, much like Britain at one point was the preeminent power, and then Britain went on decline when the US was on the ascendancy. So I say all this suggests that we have to know our African identity and to be proud of that African identity. And it's there. It was disrupted, yes, primarily during the era of the slave regime, the enslavement of Africa. People only focus on the people who are kidnapped and taken away from the continent, but they don't look at other aspects. The disruption, the internal wars that were generated, because now the wars were fought just to capture fellow sisters and brothers into captivity, because our market has been opened in the so-called New World. So the disruption in the domestic economy, the domestic trade, routes that had been established, agricultural production, the best mines were taken away. Some of the ones taken away were the best agriculturalists. Africans were very advanced in agriculture by that time. So the skills were taken to the new so-called New World in the Americas, whether North America or South America. But prior to that, we had a long history going back to Kemet. Look at the genius of the creations during Kemet. Egypt is not an African word. Egypt is a word that came much, much later with civilizations, or rather cultures, to borrow. Walter Rodney prefers to use the word cultures, because when you say civilization, then you start equating, who's more advanced, who's less advanced. So let's stick to culture. Those high levels of cultures created. Imagine the genius that it took in Kemet. Those were Africans doing this 3,200 years before Christ. Forget about that culture. Go to the much more recent cultures of Mali, of Ghana, of Songhai. Think about that. We had all of that. When you look at countries like England, they just came yesterday in the 10th century. Italy, just came yesterday in the 19th century, right? So we have all that foundation that I think would make a tremendous difference if Africans become not only conscious of that, but practice that, make that their persona, make that the African identity. Don't think you're inferior or secondary to anybody. So that's why we have to look at history of victories that we had, because normally the history, when you look, it's propaganda that Africa was very readily conquered by the West. There was no resistance. Basically, people just lay down and said, yeah, we're ready to be colonized and civilized. That's all nonsense. So that's why I thought the story of Adwa was very important. Because we're talking, this is a period during the scramble for Africa, when they had the Berlin Conference, they partitioned the continent amongst the European powers. And then Italy comes to Ethiopia, or to use the previous name that was more popular, Abyssinia. So they come to secure their empire now, their colony. And at the Battle of Adwa on March 1st, 1896, the Italian army is completely annihilated. Annihilated to the extent that the Ethiopians they kill almost 3,000 Italians and capture almost another 3,000 and march them back to Addis Ababa, the capital named by the Empress herself, Empress Teitu. And they are compelled to work under the supervision of Africans, right? So now they see how it feels when the tables are turned. They're working in enslaved-like conditions commanded by Africans for many, many months, until Italy pays millions and millions in reparations before they are released. That is an important history to show how Africans fighting on the battlefield stopped white supremacy and imperialism on its track. And the white supremacy part, of course, accompanied whether it was slavery, to justify enslaving Africans, colonialism to justify colonizing Africans, saying, oh, they needed civilization. That's all white supremacy. And in the case of Italy, the commander-in-chief, General Oreste Baratieri, when he was still in Rome, promised the king, at that time Italy was still a kingdom, King Umberto, that he would come back to Rome with Emperor Menelik in a cage to be displayed, only to find out the so-called savages were not willing to cooperate in that idea. Baratieri himself ends up fleeing from the battlefield. One general is captured, 2 generals are killed, And it's so interesting that when I was doing the research and looking at some of the coverage at that time, there were some magazines that claimed Ethiopians were actually Europeans, they're white. And that's so Italy actually lost a war to fellow Europeans. They were much more willing to accept their propaganda than to accept the propaganda that they'd been defeated on African soil. I think this story should be widely known. At least all Africans should know it. All Pan-Africans should know it. Africans in diaspora should know it as well. And 2 final points. One, I gave it the title Empress Taitu and Emperor Menelik in Love and War. The love and war part describes them as a couple with a normal loving life as a couple. The war, of course, describes that when it came to the time to fight, they had to fight together as a couple. And that's the war part. And the Empress herself had 6,000 men under her command. And she has not been given the proper recognition for her bravery in that victory. So that's why the cover of the book also displays her centrally and very prominently. And then the second point is that I had the book illustrated to give it, because most young readers now like visual, right? So that's why the book was illustrated by a brilliant artist who's actually an architecture student at Makerere University in Uganda. So he did a very brilliant artwork for the book. And of course, the book, the e-version is available on Amazon. Paperback is also going to be available on Amazon later this week. The hard copy, which I call the collector's edition, is available on a dedicated website for the book. And that website is Taitu and Menelik.com. So it's just the first name, Taitu, Taytu, and then the word and, A-N-D, and then Menelik, the emperor's name, MENELIK.com. So that's the website where people can order the hardcover. If people watching from the continent, from the motherland, from Africa, I imagine it's probably easier for them to order the e-version from Amazon.
That is true. I mean, I appreciate the work that you're doing in terms of, because the channel aims to celebrate those who are making a difference in our times, right? And I think that is where Africa has gone wrong in terms of celebrating those who have been,
Yes.
creating a difference in our times, right? And it's good that we are now even celebrating women because they have been left out for a long time. And
Absolutely.
so seeing movies like The Woman King and, having
Yes.
our empire and General Naniska and being celebrated for her role as the
Yes.
general of the empire. That's amazing.
Absolutely.
That is really good. And I hope more people are able to see your book, read it, and really have an understanding of some of the victories that we had. Because unless the lion, they say, unless the lion, and until the hunter, how does that go? Like there's
well, you could say until the lamb starts telling his story.
The story of the hunt would always glorify the hunter. Yeah. So it's good that now we have these platforms to be able to share these stories, and we have individuals like yourself who are willing to go research and present it in a way that is more engaging and readers can find it.
Right, and I'm glad you said that. It's more engaging, and I did that intentionally too. So I took all the historical facts, remain 100% accurate, but I also created some dialogue. That's why I call it dramatic history. So for example, when the Empress is confronting the ambassador Antonelli of Italy over the deception, because they went to war because Italy had deceived them. They had two versions of a treaty, and one version of the treaty in Amharic said whenever Ethiopia wanted, it had the option of using Italy to do its business with other European powers. But the Italian version said Ethiopia was obligated to go through Italy. So essentially made Ethiopia a colony by deception, by deceiving the Ethiopians, not even letting them know. And so when the Empress is angry and engaging Antonelli, why did you deceive us like this? So I created a conversation to visualize and make that exchange much more impactful.
Yeah, it's good nowadays to be creative in the way we present content, especially to
Yes.
people like ourselves.
Yes.
So we can now say we have established that the Western medias have played a huge role in terms of creating propaganda that made Africans feel inferior.
Oh, definitely.
So created the inferiority complex to them. And right, is it the same thing happening right now? Because every time you hear news from Washington, all they say is that, Africa is now getting into debt trap, right, with the
Right.
Chinese. Is that the reality? Is that what is happening, or it's the same old stories that have been happening in the continent?
Well, okay, two parts. Number one, it's nonsensical for the West to be talking about debt trap relative to Africa. I mean, what is the function of the World Bank? What is the function of the IMF? Are these institutions meant to develop African countries? There have been, World Bank started lending money to Africa in the 1950s when Ghana was building the Volta project, the Akosombo Dam. Show me a single country in Africa that has been, quote unquote, developed, whose economy is developed because of its relationship with the World Bank or the IMF. There's not a single one, because that's not what they're designed to do. They're designed to keep African countries non-industrialized by using the precise weapon of the debt trap. You lend them money, and then they're spending all their production on just servicing the debt, just paying the interest on the loan. And now and then, maybe a little bit of the principal, but they're not supposed to get out of that dependent position in the global economy. So for you, the bandit to be talking about that we don't need banditry, it's just mind-boggling and even offensive and very repulsive indeed. What they're afraid of is that now African countries are getting substantial financing from China, that they're no longer beholden only to the IMF and the World Bank. That monopoly is being broken. They don't care about the welfare of Africa. Africans will not need to be going to China if the money coming from the World Bank and the IMF had indeed transformed the economies of African countries in the first place. So they have no right to speak over this. We as Africans have a right to speak over that. We do. And we can say that if we're going to be getting resources from China, they should transform our economies. They should not do the same thing that the Western money has done, which is to keep us dependent, to keep us non-industrialized. As the late Samir Amin said, in fact, in an interview that he conducted in Tanzania, and part of it is available on YouTube as Africa's Challenges of Industrialization. That's the title. He was interviewed in Tanzania. And what he says is that if we have relationship with China, we should not just go for money. We should go for technology that transforms our economy as well. So if they want copper, if they want cobalt, whatever resource they have, they desire that we have, we should require that some of it be purchased in traditional money, but some be purchased in forms of technology that allows us to build these factories so that we can use the same raw materials that China now wants, that the West has always had monopoly access to in Africa. We can use those resources in the factories that we build within African countries, because that creates high-skilled employment, which of course means the workers are paid much better, but it also creates what you call interconnectivity within the economy. So there's a multiply effect. So now we are digging the minerals in Zambia or in Congo. We are transporting it to Tanzania or to Uganda or Kenya. Along the way, you're creating employment. And then we get to those factories, the factories that we're using this raw material to now manufacture everything that we are now importing from the West or from China, We are now producing some of it in African countries. We are creating more jobs. Now, after we produce these products, we are going to be shipping it to other parts of Africa. So we are doing this in East Africa. In West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, they're doing the same thing, and they're trading with us. That's how you build up Africa's economies. We can't just use the money that we get from China the same way we use the money we get from the West. Otherwise, indeed, it would end up being another debt trap situation. It's not transforming the economy, but the West should not be the people talking about this. It should be us as Africans negotiating better positions with China as we deal with China. The West are only talking about this because they are afraid of losing the exclusivity that they had enjoyed for centuries, in fact, since Africans were taken captives.
I agree with you. I mean, I think the West is afraid of the fact that it's losing its exclusivity and its influence in the African continent to
Yes.
China, because China provides an alternative to the continent that seems better than the one that they were providing before.
Absolutely.
Partly that could speak to why we are seeing lots of visits from Blinken in the African countries.
Yes.
All over
yes.
the places.
Blinken visiting, the Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, visited several African countries, including Zambia. As you know, the Vice President, Kamala Harris, just went to Ghana, and then she went to Zambia, she went to Tanzania, she went to a number of African countries. But these are superficial engagements. These engagements are irrelevant. These engagements will not transform the economies of African countries. When the Chinese visit, they're essentially following up or setting up for substantial and substantive engagement with significant amounts of money that are being put in African countries. I have no issue with that. My issue is how the money is deployed. And this is where we need to put pressure on our African leaders as well. Because China is not China's principal concern to industrialize Africa. That is our concern. China wants resources so that it can continue growing its economy. Our leaders are not making the best deals. They're not making the best demands. They're just taking the money, which is insufficient because money has not transformed Africa. Africa has been getting billions of dollars from the West and now billions of dollars from China over the past decades, since African countries started winning their independence in the 1960s. Why is there not a single industrialized country in Africa? The reason is clear. The money is not deployed to build up industries. Now, in the past, it was almost impossible because when you get money from the IMF and the World Bank, they give you what they call conditionalities. And they allegedly say you should put the money where you are best placed organically to maximize its impact. So for you in Africa, it's in agriculture. The yields relative to the money you deploy much faster. And that, in fact, on paper is true. But that's not how it happened in the West. They absorbed the cost in order to become industrialized. So they would say, if you invest this money in manufacturing, let's say an automobile, for example, the cost benefit, it's just too high. It's better and cheaper for you to just import a car from England, where the cost of production is much lower because they've been doing it for a long time. Whereas in Africa, the production cost is going to be higher. Even after you produce it, you don't have a market for it. You're going to produce cars that nobody will buy, essentially. And number one, since you're just starting, the quality is not going to be good. All of this is true, but that's called biting the bullet. That is something all of them did.
Yeah.
The initial cars they produced, even Ford, it was something it looks like you could make at home, right? Okay, but that was then. It's by constantly producing and perfecting. Yeah. That is why they produced the models that they produce today. When South Korea started producing automobiles, the same thing. In the beginning, people would laugh at it and say, oh, made in South Korea, right? But look where they are today. And how did they manage to do that? They closed their market to imports. They said, we are not going, when it comes to cars, we're not going to be importing any cars from England, from the United States. So they put very high taxes on that tariff to give their own domestic industries a chance to start producing, to improve the quality, and dominate the domestic market. And once they were ready for competition, now they know that even if the US sells cars here, our consumers, our citizens may still prefer our cars because now our cars have become competitive. We use that time period that we closed off the car industry from outside to produce and to improve our automobiles. But the World Bank and IMF will not allow any African country to do that because they talk about free market. We operate in the free market system. It's absolutely 100% nonsense. There are some products that China is not allowed to ship to the West. So what kind of free market is that? There are some industries in the West that they declare a national security issue to prevent China from setting up industries to produce those products. So why? Why this nonsense? Only when it comes to Africa do they start parroting this nonsense of free market, and African, I call them sadly, misrulers, they accept this condition.
And it's still vivid today, right? With the fact that the US wanting to ban TikTok because apparently it has a lot of influence in the US, in the States.
Think about that. And they're calling it a security threat. What about Facebook?
Instagram. These guys have been operating Snapchat. They've been operating.
What about Facebook?
Years.
It's because Facebook is an American, right? Yeah. When everybody knows is Facebook is how they've been collecting our data, right?
Yeah.
For all these years. So I'm glad you gave that comparison. That makes my point.
These are some of the things that our leaders tried to do. If you look at Nyerere, if you look at Thomas Sankara, at one point in time, they closed the country, saying that we have to produce everything that we consume so we can push for industrialization. And unfortunately, it's not happening right now. And it's so unfortunate that Africa has all the resources that we need, literally everything, you name it,
absolutely
anything, right? And now you can see countries such as Congo, they're suffering and the people are dying and the situation is worse every single day simply because they have the resources and the leaders can't be given full control of the country because they know the influence that Congo is going to be having in the continent in case that happens.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is why we also need to, because in as much as we blame the West, in as much as, people may want to blame China as well, at the end of the day, the ball is in our court. As I said, it is not up to China to build up Africa's economies. It is not up to the West to build up Africa's economy. We should know how to prevent them from taking advantage of us. And that comes from our youth on the ground. But obviously, before you do that, you have to be conscious of what is going on. And so we need to go back to the education system as well. Thankfully, now with the new media platforms and social media, African governments no longer have monopoly on education. This conversation we are having right now, you and I, are the type of conversation you should be having in African classrooms, in high schools, in universities, you see? So that every African that comes out of the university system is conscious of the reason why African countries remain impoverished. They become aware of what needs to be done to end this impoverishment and to transform our economies. But when this is not taught, you cannot blame people for not knowing. Many of our people don't know how wealthy Africa really is. They have some suspicion, but they don't know. They can't connect all the pieces together. So young people think a potential solution is to risk my life, walk hundreds of miles through the deserts, even die along the way trying to get to Libya, trying to get to the coastline in Morocco, and then trying to cross the Mediterranean to go and work as cheap, almost slave-like labor on the farms in southern Italy, or if I go much further north in Europe, end up working in toilets, in restaurants, or sweeping the street. That to them is the solution. The solution, if they were given the proper instruction and their consciousness uplifted, they would know the solution is to end bad governance within their own country. See? They would know what Thomas Sankara was trying to do in Burkina Faso, make Africa truly independent so that you're not dependent on your food. That's the number one thing. You have to start with food self-sufficiency. If you're not food self-sufficient, you can't do anything else. Nothing else can develop. Everybody eats. Everybody deserves proper nutrition. If you can't satisfy that, then you're beholden to whomever is feeding you. And that has been the West. For example, right now, African countries spend $35 billion every year importing food. Just think about that. You know how many people we could educate with this money? How many health care facilities we could build and the medicines acquire? Do you know? So that is one example, you know. And Sankara taught this within a short 3 years. Burkina Faso was food self-sufficient. But the powers that be that want to keep Africa dependent don't like that. And ultimately, that's one of the reasons why Sankara was eliminated. And of course, the other issue that he spoke about was the debt burden. This was not debt from China. This was debt from the West that he was talking about. And he said, we have to speak with a collective voice. If I speak individually, this was in 1987 in July at what was then Organization of African Unity, the predecessor organization of the African Union. So if I speak as an individual, president of Burkina Faso, I will not be alive to attend next year's OAU conference. October, he was killed. This is due to the Western influence over Blaise Compaoré, who killed him. So, but we need for our youth to know that these are the things that are holding Africa back, not by accident, by design. It's meant that way. Because if Africa starts getting its fair value for all the raw materials that go into the industries in the West, obviously there's going to be some diminishing in the standard of living in these countries. And that is what they're not willing to yield, even a penny on that. So they would rather support militaristic or military regimes that are corrupt, brutal, like the one you have in Uganda under General Museveni, the one they had in Congo under Mobutu, you know, for decades. They would rather sustain Blaise Compaoré in Burkina Faso for 27 years, you know, instead of have Sankara continue the agenda that he had for self-empowerment. So can you imagine if every leader in an African country was adopting, even partially, what Sankara was doing on Burkina Faso? Within a generation, Africa would be transformed. Really.
And it's so unfortunate because they're looking, right? They're keeping a close eye. And when they see leaders such as the Thomas Sankara, when they see leaders such as the Kwame Nkrumah, when they see leaders such as Muammar Gaddafi, when they see leaders such as Patrice Lumumba, they always take them down.
Yes.
And so how do we avoid that in our current generation, right? How do we avoid having leaders who care for the welfare of their people being taken out? And most of the times, the game is really about turning the people against their own leader, right? And I think we have seen with Kwame, we have seen with Sankara, we have seen with Lumumba, we have seen with Gaddafi, all these leaders who are good to their people. And nowadays, I usually tell the young individuals I interact with, I'm like, do you want to know your leader is good or bad? It's really a simple question. Does the West like your leader? If the answer is yes, then you know you're in trouble. But if the answer is no, then that's a good leader, most definitely, because the leader is working towards your own welfare.
Right. Okay. So that has been the challenge, right? How do we keep the progressive pro-Africa leaders alive, right?
Yeah.
I don't think we can do it alone. We need to build alliances with uh, with like-minded people in the West, and they could be in the academic establishment, they could be activists, they could be people that impact, influence in these countries. We have to build strong alliances with them, and then of course we have to also do something about corporate media, because corporate media also helps sanitize the crimes against Africa, either by ignoring some stories or misrepresenting some stories, giving emphasis to stories that are marginal while de-emphasizing stories that could be impactful. And let me give you an example of this. During the NATO war on Libya, the NATO-US war on Libya, African Union came up with an African plan to call for a ceasefire, to create a humanitarian corridor for relief, to organize elections, right? That would be supervised and conducted and administered by the international community. So Gaddafi himself would have no role in organizing these elections. He only had one demand, one condition, that he would be allowed to participate in these elections and campaign.
Which,
and of course, the West
right
could not take that chance, because in spite of what they were saying about him, they knew that he could actually win a democratic election that he himself has no role in organizing or announcing who won it. He had agreed on that. Jacob Zuma went twice to South Africa, to Libya, and met with him, the former South African president. He agreed. Who heard about that plan? In the New York Times, it was buried very deep in the newspaper as a thin little story. Probably people never heard about it on CNN or the BBC, because that's how determined they were to fulfill the agenda, to exterminate Gaddafi and get control of the oil. So unless we can find a way to counter this type of media, that is going to be a very serious challenge as well. So let's not underestimate the challenge that we'll face from media. Of course, media was once again playing its nefarious role, demonizing Patrice Lumumba in 1960 and making it easy for him to be exterminated by the Belgians. So that's one of the aspects that we need to also control. The media, how to counter that, the Western media. But that's where some of our allies, if we create allies in the West, they can also help us counter this. Some of the intellectuals who may be able to write op-eds to push against this propaganda, activists that can help us organize protests against egregious policies. There was no major protests during the NATO war on Libya here in the United States. No significant war. First of all, they did a number of things. Demonized Gaddafi as somebody who was, quote unquote, killing his own people. So what was the solution to stop somebody killing his own people? By bombing the country 24/7 for almost a year, right? That was the solution. Up to date, we don't know how many Libyans were killed. We don't know the nature of the destruction of infrastructure, but he was so demonized that nobody in no significant groups were willing to organize protests to say, what are you doing to this African country? And the support from sisters and brothers in the United States, that was eliminated by shifting Libya away from Africa and saying, oh, this is a Middle East country, so a Middle East problem. So don't get so passionate about this, in fact, See, so the challenge from media is going to be very significant. But apart from that, we need for our young people to know the connections between bad leadership in Africa, allowing these companies to exploit our resources, and, as I said earlier, selling our resources cheap, just taking money without demanding that we want technology so that we can also build the factories. But as I started this particular point, I said, thanks to platforms such as yours, this type of conversation, we need to disseminate it widely. And I find that young people are willing to accept that kind of information and to start transforming their own outlook. Because this is what I teach in my classes at John Jay College. The reason why African countries are in this marginalized, dependent condition are because of some of the factors that we've been talking about here today. By the end of the semester, when they leave my class, they've already been transformed. In fact, at some point during the semester, they start telling me, so, oh, the professor, some of the lessons that I learned here, I've been sharing with my dad or with my mom or my siblings,
That's
so
beautiful.
they have a yearning for that type of information. Imagine if we can get some of our schools to start teaching this type of information, because we're very basic. We've had our conversation here. We've spoken for maybe 40 minutes. Look how much material we've already covered. Even a 1 hour lesson that is required of every student in this African university would transform them as well.
Indeed, it definitely would. As a matter of fact, I had a student who reached out to me. He's working right now, but he reached out to me saying, I really enjoyed an episode you did with my professor, and we are speaking about economics in Africa, right? And so people want this type of knowledge, right? But
Yes.
unfortunately, it has been hidden from them with the media.
Yes.
Luckily enough, now we can create platforms such as this ourselves, where we can share the
Absolutely.
type of information that has been hidden from the mainstream media.
No, without a doubt. And that's why I always welcome being on this platform to have this kind of very empowering conversation. I have young people from Uganda always sending me requests that I provide, lessons for them as well. In fact, I just responded to one. It's still on my Twitter page last week from one of the students. And I said, okay, in fact, I'm going to start organizing a once a month open lecture for the student and his colleagues. And he was very happy, responded. He's saying, let's make sure this happens. And I said, of course, we'll make it happen. Once a month, we'll agree on a particular date. And thank you for this new technology, Zoom or StreamYard. And I'll break down some of the lessons that they need to know. The importance of being food self-sufficient. That is very critical. The importance of not allowing our leaders to continue giving away our raw material. In fact, we should not call it, because when you call it raw material, it's almost like it has no value.
It's
And I guarantee you, we are not the ones that came up with that word, raw materials. I bet you the exploiters are the ones who came up with that word, raw materials. In my class, when we have conversations, every time a student says something, words we've been conditioned to use on a regular basis, I say, okay, so could you elaborate? What does that word mean? So a student used the word third world. Okay, good point. What's a third world country? And the student was thinking, are they found in Europe? Oh, no. In Africa, maybe? Yes, it's okay. So explain to me what a third world country and why are they found in Africa? You see? And then we go through the process. Are you saying it's because the impoverished, people who walk with no shoes? Is there a particular reason why you say they're found in Africa? Then the student is thinking as I'm, shooting these questions rapidly. Do we understand why the most wealth-endowed continent can have so many impoverished people at the same time? Have we addressed those questions? If it's not their fault, really, do they really deserve to be called third world? Because third world has a hint of permanency, that they will always be like that. Whereas we know that the condition that places them in that position is actually a temporary condition that can be reversed if we do the right things. If we do the right things, they will no longer be third world. China in 1959, per capita income was $90 per head. Ghana was 190 per head. Ghana's per capita was double that of China, more than double. They were both so-called third world countries. Is China still a third world country? Of course not. So it is not a permanent condition. It shows you that something was happening in China that China managed to reverse and eliminate. That same thing is still persisting in Africa. And if African countries could do that, eliminate and reverse that, then the word third world would never be identified with Africa again. So that's the way I make my students think,
It's good and it's very important. And it's nice that you are going to be giving the lectures that you have planned to be doing, because something that I think we also need to focus on a lot is how do we ensure that African Americans and the Africans in the diaspora are able to work together with Africans in the continent to better the continent, right? Because there's a lot of potential if all these three groups were to work together for the
Correct.
betterment of the continent. And this is something that we had seen leaders such as Malcolm X doing back in the days, right? Oh, there you go. Malcolm
As soon as you started talking about that, I reached out for my copy of the book. The Dead Are Arising, The Life of Malcolm X, written by my good friend, Les Payne, the late Les Payne. He's a very good friend. He was a mentor of mine. And his daughter, Tamara Payne, who is also a good friend of mine. And Malcolm saw that potential in the 1960s. And that's why he traveled to Africa in 1964 extensively, to Ghana, to Nigeria. He went to East Africa. He met Jomo Kenyatta. He met Milton Obote. He met Nyerere. He met Abdurrahman Mohamed Babu, who was the Minister of Economic Planning at that time. He met Kwame Nkrumah. He met Sekou Touré. He met Gamal Abdel Nasser. He met all of them. And part of it, of course, was trying to get them to take the issue of human rights abuse of sisters and brothers in this country, to take it before the United Nations as a violation of their human rights. He said, if African countries could take the issue of Portugal abusing Africans in its colonies to the UN, if it could take the issue of apartheid South Africa to the UN, it should also take the issue of the abuse of sisters and brothers in this country to the UN. But apart from that, he also wanted to build tight relationships between African countries and sisters and brothers in this country. That is why, after the Organization of African Unity was founded, OAU, he also founded the Organization of African American Unity, or was it Afro-American Unity, OAAU, modeled after the OAU. And he wanted to build that into a platform that would unite Africans in diaspora, African descendants, not only in the United States, but in the Caribbean, South America, in large countries like Brazil, and then have the OAAU combine its resources with the OAU. And that, to me, I believe myself, and many people, by the way, was the primary reason why Malcolm was eliminated. The people who pulled the trigger may have been people from his old organization, the Nation of Islam, but that was just the elimination process. In fact, Now it's suspected that the police in New York were actually aware of this plot, but of course it fell within the same motive to have Malcolm eliminated. So they did nothing to stop this assassination. So we need to revive what Malcolm was doing, is the main point that I wanted to emphasize. He saw the potential. No one else has been able to see the importance of that potential the way Malcolm was able to see. So I hope we keep pushing for that, and that we reach the level of the tightness of relationship that Malcolm was hoping would materialize.
In as much as it can be so unfortunate, but I am pretty sure that there are people who will be listening to this and they have never heard of Malcolm. They have no idea who Malcolm is.
Yeah, which of course is a shame, because I imagine that many are probably familiar with Dr. King, the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., because then that once again goes back to the whole issue of media. You know, King was celebrated and portrayed as the anti-Malcolm, that because he advocated nonviolence, and that Malcolm was demonized as somebody who was an advocate of violence. And it's so interesting because at the end of his life, as you know, he had left the Nation of Islam, had become an Orthodox Muslim. He made the trip, the Hajj, to Mecca. And then after that, he embarked on his African tour. And Malcolm was now talking less about Black and white as the main issue that needs to be tackled, white racism. He was talking about white racism as a component of capitalism. So the main challenge was actually capitalism and what capitalism was doing to marginalized communities in terms of exploitation of these communities. There was a common, should we say, enemy between workers that are exploited regardless of what your skin tone or skin color is or your nationality, and those who have accumulated resources in the hands of a few. So he was much more presenting a political economy analysis. So, but they forget about that Malcolm. They want to focus on the Malcolm who at the early stage was saying by any means necessary, and obviously was understandable. They were shooting down people protesting against racism in the South. They were lynching them. Extrajudicial executions, bodies will be found of people, activists working to fight against racism, sicking police dogs on peaceful demonstrators, hosing them down with water cannons, beating them with police baton. So it was saying everybody has a right to defend themselves. You know, that's the Malcolm that they demonized, not the later Malcolm who had become as much an intellectual as Dr. King was, and much more impressive because he didn't have the academic credentials. You know, he never went to college, largely self-taught and tutored by very eminent scholars. One of his mentors, of course, was Dr. John Henry Clark, who would give him hours and hours of tutoring. And he had an insatiable appetite for reading. So Malcolm is, and for people listening that are not familiar, before you get to this book, The Dead Are Arising, I recommend you read the autobiography. Start with that one, Autobiography of Malcolm X, as told to Alex Healy. But then it tells you the impoverished upbringing that he came from, the background that I'm sure many listeners would be familiar with and identify with, and how as a teenager, he was already committing crimes, you know, involved in drug dealing, involved in theft, and eventually arrested convicted and served some prison time. But when he was in prison, that is when he truly transformed his life. First, he joined the Nation of Islam, which, of course, for people not familiar, they really didn't follow the orthodox Islamic tenets. They didn't go by the Quran, for example. So they had their own interpretations of it. So Orthodox Muslim would not really recognize them as Muslim. But nonetheless, the organization was known for taking people like Malcolm with criminal background and instilling them with discipline, with the need to educate themselves, and the need to give back to their communities. And that benefited Malcolm tremendously. He read when he was in prison. By the time he came out, he served his sentence, he had become tremendously self-educated. And then he became the chief spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. But Malcolm kept evolving. And obviously, it started becoming clear to him that some of the history of the creation of Black people and white people that the nation had as part of its tenets, to an intelligent person like him, didn't make sense, right? And the nation also prohibited its members from getting involved in active politics, right? And that, of course, also ties your hands if you want to challenge the system. And I say all this as a caveat because at the end of the day, the nation did something which the US government had not been able to accomplish. In fact, the US government had done the opposite, right? Just promoting mass incarceration, criminalizing, African descendants in this country. The nation transformed them into law-abiding citizens, into people that wanted to create their own. They had their own establishments, their own schools, their own financial institutions, their own restaurants. So these are the type of, in fact, it's almost similar to the kind of independence that Sankara wanted for people in Burkina Faso. The nation was doing that in the United States. So that's why its impact should never be diminished. But at some point, I think Malcolm intellectually outgrew the restrictions, the other restrictions that I mentioned that the nation had. He evolved into Orthodox Muslim, into a much more political economy critique of the repressive condition for sisters and brothers in this country. So Malcolm needs to be placed in the same category as Dr. King. And what's so ironic was that at the end of his life, Dr. King was shifting toward Malcolm's direction. He had become extremely frustrated by the persistent racism and the lack of significant impact that the nonviolent approach that he had advocated all his life was having. So in fact, if you listen to one of his last speech, the mountaintop speech, which is also available on YouTube, you'll see that he's much more militant now. He's saying, we need Black economic disinvestment from institutions that don't respect us. Take your money away from, the banks controlled by European Americans and put it in banks in your neighborhood. Don't buy particular types of products, consumer products. They disrespect you. They don't invest in your community. They don't hire from your community. So he was becoming much more militant. And had he lived, who knows, if you want to also get a gauge of how his politics had changed, and he had also become much more focused on a political economy critique of capitalism, another speech by Dr. King that I recommend is Why I Am Against the War in Vietnam. And that speech is also available on YouTube. And if you listen to that speech, you would almost imagine like he had just sat in a lecture by Samir Amin when his critique of capitalism. So the two are actually converging. So King also, and this is not widely taught as well, also saw the need for developing that relationship with the African continent. He never had the time or opportunity to go on the kind of tour that Malcolm did in 1964, the year he was killed. But to see how Africa and Kwame Nkrumah and the independence of Ghana inspired Dr. King, there's a speech on YouTube called Birth of a New Nation. And that's the speech he gave after he came back from the independence celebration in Ghana. Many people may forget this, but Dr. King, who actually attended Ghana's independence celebration, he was only 27 years old. But Kwame Nkrumah had recognized Dr. King's brilliance and genius at that early age and invited him amongst the many American dignitaries who were invited to attend Ghana's independence celebration in 1957. So that speech will give you the sense of how he was inspired. You know, he talked about, crying tears, hearing Nkrumah speak about independence and seeing the British flag coming down and the Ghanaian flag going down. So Dr. King, Malcolm, had they not been prematurely killed, who knows how the relationship would have evolved between Africans in diaspora, particularly the United States, and Africans on the continent. So coming back to your question, we need to revive that effort in a very significant way.
And what are some of the ways that you think we can use to revive that relationship?
Okay, very good. First of all, we need to have this kind of dialogue we are having right now. We need to have dialogue like this, where you have brothers and sisters from the continent on one end of the conversation, and you have sisters and brothers from here in the United States also sharing this platform and having the same discussion that we are having right now. That's one thing. We need to have events as well. I like what has been happening recently in Ghana. Many sisters and brothers from the United States going to Ghana. We need to multiply those type of gatherings, but it should not be only festivities. In these type of gatherings, we should have this type of conversation we're having right now. We should have people present papers, lectures, presentations, the need to create that bridge. What are the benefits of it? What has historically diverted us from that direction? What are some of the propaganda out there that have diverted us? There's a movement in this country right now, basically repeating the propaganda of the African role in slavery and the slave trade. And they are looking at it from a very ahistorical position. I think Walter Rodney, in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, deals with that very effectively in terms of the African role. There was no market for enslaved Africans until the West, the so-called New World, opened that market, right? The market for just plundering people for the sake of plundering, wars of plundering captives, that came with the Atlantic slave trade. That is not to say that people were not in captivity. We had wars and conflicts in African societies, and captives would be taken. They would work on behalf of their captors, but there's a significant difference. They would be integrated eventually into the society.
Yeah, become part of the community.
even end up being rulers in that society. But there was no setting where you could go to an African region and find a slave auction block. That historically did not exist. Now you had, of course, the Indian Ocean slave trade as well. Then, of course, that was commercialized as well, where you had slave markets in places like Zanzibar, you see? So these are all external type commercialized slavery, not punitive captivity, which is a distinct difference from the Atlantic slave trade, taking captives to work them on plantations until they die, taking more, work them to extract value, pure and simple. Very different from captors taken after conflict between two African communities. So unfortunately, there are a few some sisters and brothers who are not familiar with this history and the context of the history, just hear, oh, so Africans involved in so, okay, that's it. I want nothing to do with Africa. So in these type of gatherings, we would counter that type of propaganda with education and with the analysis that I just gave you, for example. So we need to have those conversations digitally and in person, because in-person interactions also, it's very different from a digital, conversation, because that's how human beings relate to each other and become closer, right, by the physical contact. So we need to have both. And I hope we'll see more and more of that. Not just, let me fly to Ghana and dress up in some kente and have some Ghanaian food and go and look at the door of no return. And then I can say, okay, I've done my African thing. No, we want to go beyond that.
And it's also good,
and we must go beyond that.
And it's also good to see that some African Americans are also, or the descendants from the African continent, are also coming back to invest in the continent and build business in the continent. And most recently, I've seen Margaret Wade. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she used to have her companies in the US and she had to close them, bring them back to Senegal and have the production taking place in Senegal, right? Because she's also trying to avoid having things such as AIDS or buy one, and then someone in somewhere in the African continent will, I don't know, get some money or whatever it is. And it's good to see that right now people want to invest in the continent, right? So that's a very good opportunity, especially for entrepreneurs in the continent, because the more businesses we have in our continent, the more we are able to utilize our own resources and then create finished goods and then sell them as finished goods. So that's also really inspiring to see. Did you see the open letter that Chimamanda Adichie wrote to President Joe Biden regarding the Nigerian election?
No, I'm sorry, I did not. Give me a summary of what were the main points, and maybe I can react to the points.
Most Nigerian youth believe that they have voted for Peter Obi, and they believe that Peter Obi should be the next president. And I was fortunate enough to have a conversation with my brother, David Undeini, who is an investigative journalist in Nigeria. And he said that he saw the numbers, he saw data, and it proved that Peter Obi had won the election. However, as it stands, Tinubu is the president-elect. And Joe Biden sent congratulations to Tinubu, right? And so Chimamanda reached out saying that you are the leader of a country that says it fights for democracy across the world. And yet you are here congratulating a president who hasn't been elected by a democratic process. And then we also had Wole Soyinka, I'm sure you're quite familiar with him, who seems to be supporting Tinubu. And apparently he has been receiving a lot of backlash from Nigeria's youth because they say, you know what, we voted for Peter Obi. He should be our president. And the numbers and data say that he should be our president. So it's so inspiring to see young individuals taking an interest in political affairs and standing up for themselves and saying, you know what, we are the young individuals, we are the ones who are going to be affected by this election more than the 83-year-old.
Right.
So I think in a way, it also says that what we are doing seems to be working because young people are being inspired to engage in political affairs. And now we can see the difference and we can see the impact that it makes.
Right. Okay. So to that, I have a few comments because I also related to what happened in Uganda, of course, in 2021, when it also appeared overwhelmingly clear that the challenger, Bobby Wine, Robert Kyagulanyi, better known as Bobby Wine, that was his stage name, was for his music. It also was quite clear that he overwhelmingly defeated General Yoweri Museveni. On that occasion, it was so clear that the US actually put a statement on the website of the State Department saying the elections were neither free nor fair, and also issued some sanctions against Ugandan officials involved in disrupting the election and manipulating the election. And yet, on the one hand, you're saying, okay, it wasn't free or fair, meaning after Museveni declared himself the winner, he was not a legitimate president. Yet, in December, when the US hosted the so-called Africa-US Leader Summit, Museveni was there in the White House, being invited. So that hypocrisy of the United States is long and extensive. Obviously, beyond hypocrisy, the US was involved in the extermination of Patrice Lumumba. The US was involved in the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah. If you go to the archives of the State Department, and offhand, I don't know the exact URL, and you put Ghana, depending on the subject you want, put maybe Ghana and Nkrumah, or Ghana, Nkrumah coup. Put Ghana, put various searches, Ghana, Nkrumah coup, and World Bank. There's a document that the United States wrote, and I forget whether it was authored by the State Department or the CIA, which was suggesting that even though the World Bank had improved a loan to Ghana to help build the Akosombo Dam for the Volta project, the money should not be disbursed quickly. They should hold back on the money. And if they hold back on the money, this is going to cause the citizens because it's going to impact the economy negatively. So Ghanaians are going to become resentful of Kwame Nkrumah, probably protest. And then as the economy weakens, the police and the army would then overthrow Nkrumah. This is them writing the memo in 1965. In 1966, Nkrumah is overthrown, right? We could do a whole show just analyzing those memos that they wrote. So why am I saying all this? I say all this to suggest that the US, when it comes to its interest supersedes. It's much more important than democracy or the rule of law in an African country. They did that with Patrice Lumumba. They did that with Kwame Nkrumah. They're helping sustain a ruthless autocrat in Uganda. So it's not surprising that they would take that position in Nigeria. So obviously in Nigeria, I don't know what attempts are continuing to audit the election, perhaps. That's one thing that the US supported in Afghanistan many years ago. Then the election, there was disputed, there was a call for audit. So I don't know if that's what sisters and brothers in Nigeria are demanding for as well, because that's certainly a possibility, and a forensic audit would be able to determine who indeed is the rightful winner of those elections. That's something that I would definitely support. I'll write about if that's what they're demanding for. We can even help them mobilize like public opinion with petition campaigns, so that the rightful winner of the Nigerian elections can then take office. But to believe that the US on its own, without any pressure, would do the right thing, that is not going to happen. So yes, I support the letter like that. If the letter is also demanding for an audit, then I even support it more. Because that to me is a potential solution.
One of the reasons that got Muammar Gaddafi killed was the fact that he wanted Africa to use gold as their currency, and he also wanted to use gold as the medium of exchange when it came to oil. And it's so interesting to see that more and more countries which are oil producers and they're leading in that field, in that industry, are now moving away from the dollar.
Correct.
What does that mean for the US?
Well, it means a number of things. Number one, that perhaps the US will finally realize what Britain had to realize at some point. That at some point, a new empire starts emerging and it supersedes the old empire. Britain was the empire of the day for a long time. And then after World War II, it became very clear that Britain could not go back to being the empire of old. Europe was exhausted. Europe was defeated. Europe needed the United States bailout through the Marshall Plan to recover its economy, to rebuild its cities, rebuild the infrastructure, to get the factories working again, to create jobs for people and to be able to pay them. It was American money. Otherwise, those countries would have remained in the similar position that most African countries are today. You see? Africa never got its Marshall Plan for the destruction of the slave trade and the destruction of colonialism. Otherwise, Africa might have been able to recover as well and enjoying the rank of industrialized, developed economies as well. That never happened. That happened for Europe, thanks to the United States. And then after that, of course, the United States became the preeminent power, which it remains today. But China is now emerged as the next power. It's the ascendant power, just like the US was the ascendant power when Britain was on the way down. So obviously now there's been talk of perhaps switching to the Chinese currency. There's been this conversation for many years now. There's the organization called the BRICS, right? Which includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, right? And that they could emerge as a potential source of financing because all countries need finance, right, for your projects. And that's why they're so beholden to the World Bank and IMF. That had been the traditional source of financing. It's changed a little bit with China coming into the play. So now BRICS was seen as an organization that could potentially emerge with its own currency, right? Or maybe promote the Chinese currency as the currency of choice. So all these, of course, are the kind of things that the Western powers don't like hearing because you're talking about a possible rival. It's not so much that they hate you for ideological reasons. It's just greed and profit, They want to monopolize the profit, right? As if only people in the West deserve high standards of living. So Gaddafi realized that he could do a lot with Libya's resources, Libya's gold. And one of the plans that had already started, already set some gold aside, was to launch a new African currency, a Pan-African currency backed by Libyan gold. And the country that panicked foremost was France, when French intelligence got that information. It was on that basis that France made the decision to exterminate Gaddafi. We know for a fact that the intervention to save Libyans from preventing being killed by their own leader was complete nonsense. How do we know that? Because they killed far many multiples of Libyans with their bombings than Gaddafi ever did. So that could not have been the reason for the intervention. The intervention was to eliminate his government and physically exterminate him. The need to physically exterminate him because there was the other secret, which is no longer a secret. He had loaned money to Sarkozy, Nicolas Sarkozy, for his presidential campaign. So obviously, they never wanted this word to get out. During the war, they started talking about it, the Libyans. And, Sarkozy was denying it. Well, lo and behold, just recently he was tried, was he not, in France for that corruption and convicted for that. And then, of course, the third reason was that they hoped they would get to control the oil fields of Libya. So those were the three primary reasons for exterminating Muammar Gaddafi and for getting rid of his government at any cost, to the cost of spreading through terrorism throughout North Africa, the Sahel, and in West Africa, by unleashing all those weapons that became available when Gaddafi's government was destroyed. And the arsenal of weapons was just anybody could grab whatever they wanted. Those are the weapons that are now causing destruction in Mali, in Guinea, in Chad, in Cameroon, you name it, even as far as Nigeria, right? But your question goes essentially to the currency issue. The US dollar has had its heyday, just like the British pound once had its heyday. Everybody wanted the pound. Who didn't know the word, the British pound sterling, right? Everybody knew that word. And it dominated. It was the Coca-Cola of currency, right? Just like the US dollar has been the Coca-Cola of currency. But things are changing. It's so interesting that of all the people, it was Marx who said, the capitalist will build the rope with which they will use to hang themselves. And people have been saying, oh, he's been wrong, he's been wrong, he's been wrong. But his analysis actually, is on point. Because what's happening? The capitalists in the United States have become so greedy that they've crushed the middle class. There's no middle class. You need 3 or 4 jobs to survive in this country. And I had this conversation. It hit me suddenly when I was speaking to a very wealthy person, a billionaire. And this information he offered without me even soliciting it. He said, Milton, we're going to see social upheavals in this country, even revolution possible. I said, why do you say that? He said, because when I started making my money in the 1980s, he's a very senior citizen now. He's about probably 88 years old now. He told me this about maybe 8, 10 years old. When I started making my money, there was a middle class in this country. You could get a decent job. You could pay off your home. You could send your kids to school. You could go on vacations. You could actually save money and retire pay off all your debt, right? He said, today that is impossible. It's gone. Just to survive, people need 3 or 4 jobs. Now there's only me, talking about himself, right? Me and my class and everybody else. No nation can survive like that, where you only have people that have it all and everybody else. And they think they're going to be able to use the police and the military to suppress this when it starts. But they're wrong. It's not going to succeed. They're dead wrong. They won't succeed. And I don't see how things are going to change drastically to rejuvenate a middle class in this country. He said, it may not happen in my lifetime, because as I said, he's almost 88 now. I think he was about 80 at the time he told me this. But it's quite possible to happen in your lifetime, pointing at me. And he's talking about the United States. And this is not a leftist analysis giving that breakdown. This is from a billionaire who has made his money from the markets and from commodity trades, you see? And that is why China continues to emerge, because China puts money in infrastructure. You have this country, Republicans not wanting money to put in infrastructure. They just want tax cuts, right? You can only put money in infrastructure, in education, in creating jobs when you have money to spend. And where do governments get money to spend? By taxing, right? But whenever they come into office, they want tax cuts for the wealthy. So, and tax the people that already have no money, the overworked underclass. There's no mystery behind why China's economy is growing at a much more rapid rate than the United States, because they invest in education, they invest in infrastructure, they invest in technology. Private business left to their own volition will not do this investment. The Chinese government is doing this investment. And that's why it's creating wealth and prosperity in China. Whereas here in the United States, the capitalists are building the road, for their own execution. Greed. It's impossible that they can wake up one day and say, you know what? We need to do the right thing as a class of capitalists. We need to put our money to revive a middle class, that cushion that allowed us to make all that wealth in the first place, historically, But that gap between those who are surviving, those on the top, the gap kept widening. And now it's at, and here's the other thing. So if you look at the main corporate media right now, the big story is about Trump being indicted, right? The big story before that was the January 6th, right? Those are the big stories. The big story is not the widening health gap. That is actually what's going to break down this country. And that cannot be the big story, because most of the media are for-profit media as well. So they would be talking about their own demise, you see? So the people who should be telling you the story about what's going on are not the major corporate media, who can reach as many people as possible, because it's not in their interest to say things are bad, things are bad. No. So they would rather demonize China. Oh, look at China. The Chinese leader meeting with Putin. It's going to embolden Putin, bringing more war to Ukraine, because now he has a Chinese partner, when in fact it's the US that does not want this war to be negotiated to an end, because it sees this as a way to destroy Russia and Putin, regardless of the cost that it imposes on the people of Ukraine and to the global economy, everybody else.
I hope Africa learns from China how to build industries, how to industrialize, and also how to build technologies that would increase productivity, would increase efficiency, would increase output, would literally increase and improve everything.
Yeah, we can. We need the right leadership, though. We need leaders who say, I'll give you copper. Give me this amount in currency, in money. Give me this amount in technology and help build the factories. Give me this amount in scholarships. Scholarships. So that we have every 2 years trained Africans in the thousands are coming back, from China. Occasionally, I know they offer scholarships to African countries, but we don't want it as a charity. We want that as part of the business plan. You see?
Part of the deal.
You want my cobalt? Yes. Money, technology, scholarship. You want my oil? Money, technology, scholarship. Natural gas, money, technology, scholarship. If we have this approach, I'm telling you, we might still be alive. You will definitely be alive when we see Africa transform. But to get there, we have to start doing it. We must.
And we also have to encourage more of relationship building between African countries with the goal of achieving Pan-Africanism.
Oh, without a doubt. And that goes back to loving ourselves as African people. My students, once they learn of Kemet, right? Once they learn of Cheikh Anta Diop and the African origins of civilization, to know that the first human beings were Africans, to know that had they not migrated to other parts of the world and through climatic and environmental adaptation, taken on different features, had that not happened, that everybody in the world today would be so-called African, melanated, that is very empowering to them. They realize that they are not inferior to anybody, So there's some basic knowledge that we need to teach. Maybe in fact, when I do that monthly lecture, I'll break it down very simply. Some 10 basic knowledge. And this would be one of them, of course. That without us, there would be no other history of the world, So we have to start from the beginning.
Indeed, we have to start from the beginning. And I think the moment we can achieve Pan-Africanism, we are going to be a very powerful continent in the world.
Yes. Pan-Africanism, that includes our sisters and brothers in diaspora as well, as Malcolm had envisioned, as Marcus Garvey had envisioned,
I also like the fact that this podcast gives me an opportunity to have conversations with individuals like yourself, because it shows that we are moving towards that. And I think it also inspires other people to think of the same way.
And thank you to technology. I mean, back in the day, you would have to wait until I can afford to come to Tanzania. And then we would have at the most 50 to 100 people listening. And then some may record it and go and share it, Now, in real time, we have this type of conversation. So anything is possible. Anything is possible. And the good thing is this: we know that we are not intellectually, inherently inferior. So we know that as a fact. Number two, we know we have the resources. And it makes sense that the creators would have the abundant resources in the part of the globe where all human beings originated in the first place. Our biggest challenge is the correct governance. So let's work on having the correct governance. Let's work on getting rid of the inferiority complex, and then we are on the road to something.
I mean, I think the moment you can achieve the two, we are set.
Absolutely. That's why I'm very hopeful. I'm generally a very optimistic person because I look at the facts, and the facts are in our favor. The setbacks we can eliminate. We have many of the leaders who are not in the interest of Africans, and we can identify those, and we have to work toward removing them so that we can have the leaders that want to benefit Africa to be in charge.
The odds have always been on our favor, and
absolutely,
let's hope now we can utilize that.
Yeah, but it's hard when you're going through immediate hardship of impoverished living, of lack of food, of lack of health care, lack of education for your children. So that can become very demoralizing. So that's why it's important to put it in context. And as Nkrumah said, I like this actually from the same book, Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. He says at the very end of the introduction, okay, I propose to analyze neocolonialism first by examining the state of the African continent and showing how neocolonialism at the moment keeps it artificially poor. Africa is artificially poor. It's manufactured poverty by preventing us from doing the right things that we need to do. How can you give somebody money and say, okay, these are the things you can do? I forbid you from doing this. So they give Africa money, this is what you can do. You must not industrialize. No, no, no. You industrialize, that automatically eliminates those borders between African countries, because now you need a larger market for your products, you see?
That's true.
But a balkanized Africa is what they desire and what they will do everything and anything to maintain.
They want Africa to keep on begging from them.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad that every single day young people will be realizing the potential that the continent they live in has. And right now, I think they're getting enough of it. And
yes.
Now they want to take matters into their own hands.
Yes, their eyes are opening. And a lot of it is because of the information they get from social media platforms. I had you mentioned TikTok earlier. I don't know how the conversation in my class the other week got to that. And then one student was talking about the congressional hearings, and ridiculing it, right? And then the other student jumped on it. So I had like 10 students now in a class of 30, all wanted to comment on what's going on TikTok. In fact, that was not the subject of the class, but you have to go with the flow. When you realize this is of great interest to students, you don't suppress the topic. So I let them have the conversation, hear me. And I learned so much from these, young students that, in fact, the congressional hearing, they need to have another congressional hearing and let the students vent about how against this attempt to shut down TikTok, the students. I don't think they know. These students said they're willing to organize protests to go to Congress. That's how animated they became in the conversation. Every one of them had their hand up like this, wanted to say something. So at the end, I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Write your thoughts on this thing that's going on, the congressional thing to shut TikTok, like an article, and send it to me. And I will weave all of it into one article. And I won't put your individual names. So don't worry, the senators won't come looking for you. I'll put my name, I'll just say edited by, me and my name. They can come looking for me, I don't mind. And then if you still feel the need to, organize a march in Washington, I'm sure there are millions of other students that feel the same way. I can tell by how animated you guys are. Maybe that's your next thing. So let's start with this article and then see if you want to organize a march. And I bring all this to say that many Africans get so much information from TikTok as well. You see? So that can also be used as a way to share this type of conversation that we've had today. Okay, so on my Kumbukeni podcast that I have with my two co-hosts, watching my phone the other day, And we have like a WhatsApp group for my family members, right? My siblings. And my sister sends me a short clip, TikTok. And I'm looking, I said, wait a minute, this is me. It was me. So some young people had gone to our podcast is an hour and a half and taken a segment about food, the importance of food independence, and just boiled it down to the TikTok thing, you know, some music in the background. And that went viral, you know. So you have to speak to students in the language that they understand. If they want to ingest it via TikTok, so I went back to my colleague, I said, listen, now we need to get somebody to help us break this 1.5 thing, take 10 very important segments, put it on TikTok version and let the young people, you know.
Because that's where they are.
As
So
Malcolm
follow them
said,
where they
if
are.
you're speaking to Chinese person, you speak in Chinese. Speaking French, speak in French. Speak the language that they understand and relate to.
And the one that they want to hear.
Exactly.
Well, this was supposed to be an hour, but we are
Yeah, I
clearly
know. Actually,
closing
it's
to
fine because, you know, you came with some of our powerful ancestors or creators, and it automatically created that extra 1 hour for you.
I am
Yeah, so it
glad
worked out
did.
well. It worked out well.
It did, and well, but thank you so much for making time to do this, and thank you for also doing this in the first place.
It's my
And
pleasure.
yeah, I think at least we can say that young Africans are in safe hands when it comes to understanding the history and understanding what's going on, and even understanding the role that they have to be playing.
Yes, their role is the most critical thing.
Absolutely. And also, well, thank you for also helping me connect with individuals like Dr. Horn, right? Because
Oh, Karibo, anytime.
and
Yes.
thank you so much.